Welcome to you all at this Pacific Peace Network webinar calling for an end to all war games in the Pacific. The Talisman Sabre exercise is currently underway in Queensland with over 17,000 military forces here planning for war. I acknowledge that we are all meeting on the lands of First Nations people, wherever we are. I come to this meeting on the unceded lands of the Jagera and Turrbal people from Brisbane, Australia, otherwise known as Meanjin, and I pay my respects to the elders of First Nations peoples wherever we are meeting at this webinar. My name is Annette Brownlee. I'm the chair of the Independent and Peaceful Australia Network, and I share the convening of the Pacific Peace Network with Liz Remiswal from World Beyond War, New Zealand. I'd like to acknowledge the support from World Beyond War and thank them for hosting this webinar. So to start off, we have a short little infographic video made about Talisman Sabre exercise in 2019. And thanks to Robin Tobenfeld from Friends of the Earth Australia for creating this little webinar. So we'll get going now. It only goes for a couple of minutes, but I'm sure you'll all enjoy it. Yeah, very creative. And again, thanks to Robin for producing this creative little video with the animals of the Great Barrier Reef, very much impacted by the Talisman Sabre military exercises. So our first speaker today is Senator Jordan Steele-John. Jordan is a Green Senator for Western Australia. He knows we need peace, and we need an end to war, violence, and nuclear armament of nations. Jordan is campaigning to remove Australia from our current alliance with the United States, and he has been critical of the hundreds of billions of dollars spent funding weapons and wants to close all foreign military bases in Australia. The Australian Greens have a vision for a new approach to defence that is focused on building cooperative, peaceful relationships within our region. And with the money saved by not buying weapons, we can address the climate crisis and create secure, well-paid jobs and build thousands of affordable homes so needed for all. And together, we believe we can create a peaceful future for all of us. So welcome, Jordan, to this Pacific Peace Network webinar.
Thank you so much to Annette, and thank you to Greta and everybody that has worked so hard to pull today's gathering digitally together with folks from across our region. Thank you to the Pacific Peace Network and to World Beyond War for playing your role in making today happen as well. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from First Nations country here in Western Australia on the lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people. Pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty over this land was never ceded. It always was and always will be First Nations land. It is a wonderful thing to be here with you all this morning. In the shadow, unfortunately, of two great contextual pieces to the moment in which we find ourselves. Our peace movement, I feel, has never been more urgently needed than it is right now at the moment, and it is a privilege as a Green, as a long-term committed peace activist, to be able to speak with you this morning. The context to our conversation, in my view, is twofold. One, we have, of course, the Talisman Sabre exercises, which were inaugurated and given purpose and meaning and justification by the so-called War on Terror. As Annette pointed out, we will soon see, and are currently seeing right now, tens of thousands of troops engage in a war rehearsal aimed at increasing tension within our region, and ultimately giving effect to the desire of the United States and of global weapons and arms manufacturers to see ultimately global spending on military armaments increase. So that is the first contextual background to our conversation today. The second is the rapid unraveling of the government of Afghanistan, and what looks to be its imminent fall to the Taliban regime. Now, this is really something that needs to be marked because, of course, its initiation was begun 20 years ago as part of the initial campaigns of the so-called War on Terror. And I think it's a very important juxtaposition to be acknowledged that while Talisman Sabre and operations like it are bigger and bolder and better funded than ever, and it is widely rumored that after September there will be a next iteration of Talisman Sabre, potentially bigger and even more resource intensive than the war games of the last 20 years or so. At the very same time, a nation of innocent people is collapsing into ruin in the aftermath of 20 years of occupation, perpetuated by fatally flawed foreign and defence policy in which Australia actively and willingly participated. As the Australian Greens spokesperson for peace and disarmament and for Veterans Affairs, I've had the lucky opportunity to engage with IPAN's membership and to draw on your collective wisdom as part of the Australian Greens process of redefining our peace policy ahead of the next federal election. And I just wanted to share with you some of the key parts of that review that were guided by feedback given to us by IPAN and your membership. I'm really happy and excited to share that our policy is now has been renamed from peace and security to one of peace, disarmament, and demilitarization, grounding us in a language that recognizes the inherently escalative nature of the security framing. It is grounded in an acknowledgement of the need for truth, justice, and healing in relations to First Nations people, and an acknowledgement of the continuing impact of the frontier wars upon First Nations people. It goes forward from that grounding to name up global cooperation facilitated by non-violent conflict resolution as essential to enabling human and environmental well-being. And clearly states that the climate crisis and the continued existence of nuclear weapons represent two of the greatest threats to meaningful world peace and therefore to human environmental well-being. As Annette mentioned, it calls for the ending of all joint defence facilities on Australian soil and the removal of foreign troops from the same, as well as the closure of the Pine Gap facility, and an acknowledgement that while that facility continues, there is a complicity on behalf of Australia in illegal drone strike activities globally. It talks very clearly about the ongoing environmental impact of military spending and of the destructive potential of games, so-called games like Talisman Sabre, upon the natural environment, and make some very specific calls, particularly for Australia to ratify the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, to play a leading role in the creation of an international ban on the development of lethal autonomous weapons, and to remove Australia from the participation and involvement in the global nuclear so-called deterrence frameworks that often serve as justification for military escalation. In closing, I'd just like to assure you of one central thing, and that is that as I and the Greens observe the growing tension in our region, that is being, I would argue, escalated by the United States so-called Pacific pivot policy into our region. We are very clear in understanding that while annihilation is the ultimate result of escalative policy, de-escalation and the achievement and maintenance of peace must be the ultimate aim of the role that we in the peace movement play. Thanks to the mentorship of good people like Joe Valentine and of Annette and of many others around Australia, I have come to understand very clearly the destructive potential of nuclear weaponry, and the reality that while it is held in the hands of the so-called key state actors in this region, we cannot allow a perpetual escalation of conflict and tension to take place, precisely because the end result of that is the purposeful or accidental annihilation of our species on this planet, and that therefore we as a peace movement and as a political movement in the Greens must advocate for peaceful, non-violent and de-escalatory policy approaches for our region, grounded in an independent foreign and defence policy here in Australia. So thank you so much for your time. I'll stay with you through to the Q&A, and would be happy to answer any questions rather. And I want to thank you for your commitment and dedication to our collective movement at this critical moment, when in many ways it has never been harder to maintain such a position. We together keep the light of peace as a prospect alive in the world, and it is an honor to do that work alongside you all. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Jordan. That the keeping the light alive is just so important when we unfortunately are all being hit with a tidal wave of rhetoric coming through our government and through our media about why we need to be prepared to go to war with China. Beats me how you know, there can be any justification for talking about war with a country of 1.4 billion people over our trading relationships with that country. But anyway, that's for us to actually work our way through. And thanks, Jordan. It's great to have you here, and I'm so pleased to know that you'll stay through to the Q&A. Our next speaker is Ronda Kelly. Ronda Kelly Naparula is a Warramungu Garawa woman I hope I've pronounced it correctly, Rhonda, who lives in Brisbane. She has 4 children and 2 young grandchildren. Rhonda's passionate about higher education, human rights and social justice, the environment and politics. And recently she retired, which is great because it gives her more time to get involved in activism. She's held numerous senior and executive positions in the community and public sectors and is committed to advocating for a healthy and secure world for present and future generations. So welcome to this webinar, Rhonda. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Annette, and thanks, Jordan, for your acknowledgement to countries, respectively. I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and acknowledge that the land that I'm sitting on is associated with the traditional custodians of the Yuggera and Turrbal peoples. Look, my approach is going to be a little bit different from Jordan's, so I may have to refer to some of my notes simply because I don't want to miss anything. But I guess from an Aboriginal perspective, I just want to highlight the difference between a European concept of conflict and resolution and Aboriginal approach. And I guess in terms of that, among Aboriginal groups across Australia, pre-contact and even continuing to this day, much of it relies on really working towards harmony and trying to resolve conflict and also work towards a peaceful resolution of disputes.
Rhonda, sorry to interrupt. We cannot see your video. Can you turn your video on?
Oh, sorry.
There you go.
Oh, sorry.
Now we can see you.
Oh, sorry. And also work towards justice. So in terms of that, I'd just like to point out we're working towards a pathway currently in Australia towards a treaty process. And there's a lot being said about Makarrata. Now, Makarrata is a Yolngu word, and basically it's the Yolngu people are from the Arnhem Land, northeast Arnhem Land. And basically that is really about trying to sort of engender peaceful relationships within communities. That's either intra or intergroups. And Makarrata, the actual word means the spearing of the leg. So this sort of conflict resolution can actually go to a physical form, or it can actually go to an agreement and agreement making. And the best way to describe one of those elements is, I don't know if people are familiar, but here in Australia, we have had a long fight for land rights, and the Gurindji people. And the key elder there's a wonderful image that you have a former Prime Minister of Australia handing over sand and dirt of country to the leader. Now, the leader doesn't say, thank you for giving back our land. He just says, now we can work in peace and walk together. And that's a key thing about Aboriginal approach to conflict. It's really sorting out the business and having people not having bad feelings towards one another. And if there is a disagreement, then it's got to be dealt with in a way that people are, I guess, in agreement towards. Now, this differs to a Western concept because conflict often results in armed struggle and extreme violence towards another people. Another element that I wanted to talk about is the importance of trade within Aboriginal society, pre-contact and just after contact. Now, Aboriginal people had extensive, First Nations people here had extensive trade routes throughout Australia. And when you trade with people, you form relationships. And similarly, international trade was going on too, pre-contact with the Macassans in Northern Australia. And even intermarrying between different peoples from Southeast Asia with Aboriginal people in the top end. So for me, it's an interesting approach that Aboriginal people worked out early on, that it's better to get along with your neighbours than to really start arguing and fighting with people. Move forward to post-European contact and settler colonialism project, that is Australia. Much of it's been based on white supremacy, I guess, and also subjugating Aboriginal peoples here, frontier wars, and it's all about land grabs and asserting an authority over others who are non-white within the region. Now, you know, not too many countries had white Australia, like had white policy, like national foreign policies that were based on race. And Australia's white Australia policy, which lasted right up until the 50s, was quite despicable. But, you know, as an Aboriginal person, we knew full well of the impact of a racialised national policy. So it comes as no surprise, really, that Australia was very eager to go into other people's wars and, you know, confront other people's sovereignty over their own nations. And that's whether it's Malaysia, Indonesia, or Vietnam within our region. And more recently, of course, Afghanistan and Iraq, which has been an absolute basket case. And has resolved in no peace at all, just a lot of money and buffering the military industrial complex. So in terms of that, you know, as an Aboriginal person, I sort of disassociate a bit from Australia. I don't really see myself as being Australian. So when the Australian government sort of deploys troops here and there, I sort of go, oh, yeah, that's expected. It doesn't mean I don't speak out, and I do attend rallies and I sort of, you know, talk to politicians and raise issues as they arise. But, you know, you do sense that you are a little bit powerless, because it just seems that the motion is in such play. And even here in Queensland, we've got a government, and I am a member of the Labor Party, but we have a government that is heavily invested in defence industries, which I try to remind colleagues that, you know, they're building tanks. What are tanks used for? And I think they don't quite understand it's that economic imperative to generate income for the local economy. But moving forward to RIMPAC and Talisman Sabre exercises, I mean, at the end of the day, these are war games designed to prepare for war and beating the drum of war. Now, you've seen the decline of the American empire in terms of economics, and, you know, threatened by China. And so here Australia is, you know, follows the coattails of the US. We supplanted, you know, the shackles to the UK, and now we embrace US foreign policy as if it's our own. It's almost as if we're the 51st state of the USA. And it's a time for really Australia and Australians to wake up and sort of imagine a world of peace without having to go to war over and fight other people's battles and, you know, question other nations' sovereignty, which we constantly do. Now, with RIMPAC, it's sort of interesting that when you see the member nations, and if it's about peace and security and for the Pacific region, it sort of bothers me that other nations, such as Israel, are actually involved in that too. And so then you sort of figure, well, it's not really about peace and security in the Pacific. It's the other motivations are something more grand and more involved than just peace in this region. One of the issues with, of course, these activities and war games is that there are environmental concerns. Talisman Sabre, I mean, it's taking place in the Great Barrier Reef. For anybody to think that's a good thing to do, it beggars belief, to be honest. It's a very sensitive area. It's being challenged constantly via, you know, industrialization along our coastline, the impacts of climate change. So to see live ammunitions being fired into the area and, you know, impacting potentially marine values, it's just ridiculous. And for what gain? And it's like in terms of a lot of these processes, like with RIMPAC, previously China's been involved, now China's out of the group. Previously Russia was involved, now Russia's out of the group. I mean, they all have a boundary to the Pacific, but it just seems that it's a dominance of who's in, who's out, which is sort of extraordinary. So with regards to the environmental impacts, you know, marine and terrestrial values are definitely going to be impacted in terms of the air emissions from the grey vessels and also the amphibious vehicles and the heavy tracked vehicles that come onto land. disturbing the land mass as well as potentially cultural heritage values on our land. So I think in terms of where we go in the future, there is no place for these sorts of war games. The money could be better spent on social programs, you know, leveling inequality throughout the world and even within Australia. So that's probably all I have to say, but thank you for the opportunity. It's something new to me to be involved in peace, but I do have grave concerns about the escalation and the potential for nuclear warfare, as well as just, you know, current warfare practices that takes place as we speak throughout the world. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Rhonda. It's great to get your perspective, particularly from an Indigenous lens. And you've raised a lot of issues there, some of which Jordan also spoke about. I just put in the chat that I'd received a message where one of the national broadcasters, SBS, has done some freedom of information, revealing that there have been cases of sexual assault against women in the Northern Territory during this and previous times of the Marine rotation. And again, that's another side of military bases have got a long history of abusing women in the countries where those bases are stationed. And
just on that, yeah, sorry, Annette, just on that point, there was another matter that I was going to talk about, social impacts, and that was one of them, the sexual assaults. Now, it does happen in the trafficking of women, but even here in Brisbane, I remember in the 80s, radio stations would broadcast and promote Australian women to go and meet men, servicemen. So basically it was pimping out young women to servicemen. So it does still happen. So thank you.
Yeah, that's right. And according to the Status of Forces Agreement that Australia signed with the United States, it means that those individuals who committed those crimes don't have to go through the Australian criminal processes. They just get taken back to their home ground and have it dealt with there. So who knows whether it leads to anything or not. Alrighty, well, our next speaker is Kyle Kajihiro. Kyle is a Japanese settler in occupied Hawaii. He lectures in the Ethnic Studies and Geography departments at the University of Hawaii and is a board member of Hawaii Peace and Justice. He's also a member of COA Futures and helped to mobilize opposition to the RIMPAC, or Rim of Pacific, exercises last year. And that was when the Pacific Peace Network really got going. So since 1996, he's worked to counter militarization in Hawaii and to build international solidarity with movements against foreign military bases. So welcome, Kyle, to this webinar.
Thank you, Annette. And aloha kako to everyone. I want to thank all the organizers and all the other panelists for the invitation and the opportunity to share our story with you all. Greetings from US occupied Hawaiian Islands. I'm a Japanese settler on Kanaka Maoli land, speaking to you from the island of Oahu in the district of Kona, the Ahupua'a of Waikiki, and the neighborhood of Mo'iliili. And I, as a non-Kanaka living in Hawaii, I've made it one of my responsibilities to try to dismantle the structures of violence and control that maintain this occupation. And one of those forces is, of course, the US military apparatus that is so powerful here in the islands. The Hawaiian historian David Malo in 1837 wrote a letter to some of the ali'i, to some of the chiefs, with a prophecy. He said, when the high tide rises or the ocean, the wave comes in, these large fish will come out of the dark ocean that you've never seen before. And when they see the small fish, they will eat them up. And so it was a warning, it was a prophecy about the coming of the empires, right? These imperial states that were looking at the islands in the Pacific as little morsels that they could devour. And so the way I want to, I guess, maybe start conceptualizing Hawaii in this story, this larger story, is that we're both a victim of American empire, as well as an accessory to the wars of that empire. So we have a dual responsibility of addressing the violence that happens here in our islands, but also the consequences of the wars that emanate from Hawaii and that affect other lands and peoples around the world. And so right now, the context is, of course, this rising, this new Cold War with China, the rising tensions that are happening. But that's actually not a new thing, right? We've seen these rising tensions before, and every time when there are, when the superpowers battle, it's the small islands in between that pay the price in the loss of sovereignty, in the loss of land and resources, loss of life. Some other things about the context, we're right in the middle of a global pandemic, and we've seen the ravages of this pandemic. We've seen the powerlessness of militarization and all of this military might to actually deal with this problem. What we need is more care. What we need is more resources for people to support each other in order to get ourselves out of this. And last year, when the RIMPAC exercises were happening, it was very clear that all the guns and weapons and ships and airplanes could not stop this virus, right? We needed people to practice care for each other. And that was care beyond just the borders of one island, one state. It really meant we had to have global sense of responsibility to each other. Another thing of the context is we're in a moment of racial reckoning in the United States. And to keep in mind that all of the wars have been racial wars or racialized wars, right? From the very beginning, the United States was built on this idea of a settler, this advancing wave of settler colonialism and the extermination of native peoples. And that idea of this sort of conquest has just swept across the North American continent. It jumped to Hawaii and it continued to move to most recently, the wars in Asia and the Middle East. And so the film by Exterminate All the Brutes by Raoul Peck, and there's a line that says, all wars are fundamentally reenact the Indian Wars. So in some ways, there's always a kind of a sense of dehumanizing the other in order to destroy them. And I think we see that playing out again and again. The thing about our islands being used as kind of a military platform for preparing for war, for commanding them, for providing the support and logistics and infrastructure for these wars, it also makes us all targets. And Hawaii has experienced that with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. We experienced it again and again, including the false missile alert a few years ago. The fact that we would actually believe that that was possible, that was a feasible threat, meant that our islands already had the bullseye on it, right? And that wasn't because Hawaii is the aloha state and that we have beautiful tropical weather and surf and all of that. It's because of the weaponry that's amassed here, the command center that's amassed here, and the threat that it represents to other peoples around the world. And so we always have to keep that in mind. As a result of these events of sort of the takeover of Hawaii by US troops in 1893, the buildup of military base, we become the headquarters of the US Indo-Pacific Command. I think, Jordan, you mentioned the pivot, the Pacific pivot. Hawaii would be the fulcrum of that pivot, right? And this is not a new pivot. It began more than a century ago when the United States first looked overseas and wanted to have stepping stones to reach China. And another way to think of it is that Hawaii, Kaleko Kaeo, a Hawaiian scholar and activist, described Hawaii as the military in Hawaii, as the head of a monstrous he'e, or octopus, right? So we would be the nerve center, the command post up in Halawa Heights. The eyes and ears are tracking satellites, collecting radar and electronic communications. The excrement are all the toxic bombs and chemicals and negative effects that flow from this monstrous octopus. But the tentacles are also reaching out and affecting other peoples and other lands across the region, right? The nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands, the buildup of bases in Guam and the Marianas, the bases in Jeju and in Okinawa and other parts, And the thing about these tentacles, if you cut off a tentacle of an octopus, it'll grow back. And we saw that with the Philippines. Filipino people expelled US bases, and now we're seeing it come back in under the guise of a war on terror, under the guise of countering China in the West Philippines, South China Sea. And so we have to deal with the problem here. That's part of our kuleana, and we appreciate all of your solidarity and support to try to work for demilitarization. I think the Pacific can be a different place if we didn't have this looming threat. The thing about training is that it's not just a preparation for war, they're actually fighting the future war in our time, right? By doing these practices, these trainings, they're sending messages, they're already flexing to try to shape the international political environment. And so those wars that they perfect are already wars that they're anticipating fighting. So we get implicated in those future wars by the fact that training is happening in our different lands. So just a little bit about the RIMPAC exercises. They're touted as the largest multinational military training exercises in the world. In 2018, which is the last time they had a full-scale training, there are about 25,000 troops from 18 different countries here in Hawaii. And it was everything from aerial to ships, doing maneuvers on the sea, to amphibious landings, to various kinds of land warfare. The other thing about RIMPAC, it's also a way that the US shapes the political environment. And so by inviting countries like Israel, right, it legitimizes their occupation of the Palestinian territories. By inviting countries like Indonesia, it legitimizes the wars and the genocide that's happening in West Papua or East Timor. And it's a way of maintaining basically the American lake. They envision the Pacific as an American lake. And so I think that one of our challenges is how do we flip the geopolitical or the geographic imagination of this region? And this is where I look to thinkers like Epeli Hau'ofa, right, the great Tongan intellectual, who talked about how the colonial vision of the Pacific Ocean is a distant and empty place with small specks of islands that are insignificant, places that can be carved up into separate little spheres, partitioned off from each other, and controlled better that way, right? That imaginary allows the kind of thing that we're seeing happening. He challenged us to think of Oceania as enormous, as connected, as full of potential, full of life and history and genealogies and futures. And I think that that's where we can start to imagine maybe a different kind of geopolitics for our region, one that doesn't see it as an American lake or Chinese lake or Japanese lake, but that Oceania stands on its own for itself and with each other to build a different kind of future. What if this was a zone of peace and not a zone of war or hegemony of any other country, right? So just to wrap up, a few things that are happening that we're paying attention to. There's right now, just this morning, it was released that the Army is doing an environmental impact statement for renewing some leases on Hawaiian Kingdom lands that have been used by the military for 65 years for $1. And so they're going through a process of reviewing the environmental impacts of renewing this lease. So we'll be mobilizing people around the theme, Ho'i Aina, military land back. The Red Hill fuel tanks are these giant tanks that the Navy dug into a mountain. They were built in World War II and they're leaking. And so we're trying to shut these things down because they sit over the aquifer that supplies Honolulu's drinking water. And then there's a threat of expanded missile defense radars on Kauai or Oahu, aimed at sort of, just turning the Pacific into this giant array for this kind of space warfare that's happening. So just in closing, I want to just mention this concept of haku. A Hawaiian activist told me once, you got a haku, which is like to weave or compose something. And so let us haku our stories, our histories, our struggles together into fibers that are strong enough and big enough that can restrain these monstrous fish that threaten to devour the earth. Thank you.
Annette, you're muted.
Okay. Yes, I'm just saying that, thank you, Kyle. I think we have to build peace movements that are like octopuses as well, and have plenty of tentacles that just keep growing. So that's great symbolism, and we stand in solidarity with those in Hawaii who have so creatively and with great strength resisted the RIMPAC exercises. So we're moving on now to our shorter presentations from people from across the Pacific. And we're very, very fortunate to have Leonie Tangama. Leonie is a member of the West Papuan community. She's based in the Netherlands, so she stayed up until the wee hours of the night to join us in this webinar, which we're very grateful for. There are apparently about 1,500 Papuans who have fled West Papua, mostly because their lives are in danger, to the Netherlands. And the majority of the community continues to fight against Indonesian oppression from abroad with, terrific strength, but awful consequences for the people in West Papua. She is the daughter of the late Bernard Tangama, Minister for Foreign Affairs in exile of the Republic of West Papua, which was unilaterally proclaimed by the Free Papua movement. So many thanks for joining us, Leonie. You're on.
Thank you very much. Good morning, and yes, it's 3 a.m. here, so I apologize if I'm a bit if I sound a bit sleepy. On behalf of Jeffrey Bomanak, who is the chairman of the Organisasi Papua Merdeka, or Free Papua Movement, and on behalf of the people of West Papua, allow me to extend to you all our revolutionary greetings. Allow me also to thank warmly the Pacific Peace Network, all the organizers, and World Beyond War for giving us this opportunity to talk and to present ourselves and to explain about what's happening in West Papua. The West Papuan issue, as you know, is an international issue. It's not an internal issue of the Republic of Indonesia. I know I'm supposed to talk about things that are happening now, but I think I will still sort of go back in history to understand what happened and why we are stuck in this situation. The West Papuan issue became a matter of crucial strategic importance during the Cold War, and the United States of America thought through its CIA played a major role in how West Papua was illegally annexed by Indonesia. And the people of West Papua are still suffering the consequences today. In December, on the 19th of December, 1961, the then president of Indonesia, Sukarno, called out for a military invasion to liberate the people of West Papua. So between quote marks, liberate. The truth of the matter is that the West Papuans were preparing to become an independent and sovereign country after Dutch colonial rule. And one of the things that former president of Indonesia called for in his speech, which is known as the Trikora speech, was to prepare for war over what he called West Irian, which was the name he gave to West Papua. But Sukarno's speech was nothing more than a call for a war of aggression, a military conflict that is fought with no other justification than territorial expansion, the expansion of Indonesia through colonial conquest. It was a call to a military invasion. It was an invasion, full stop. And conducting such a war of aggression is unlawful. The entire history of annexation of West Papua by Indonesia is a history of aggression and invasion where the Indonesian military played the main part. And as they moved into the territory, they built bases and military commands to control the people, to control the area. It is also a police state where the military and the police integrate society and place their own spies everywhere to monitor what is happening, which is one of the reasons very often they will leave us, the Papuans who are in the diaspora, to do the talking rather than them in West Papua. West Papua is the most militarized region in Indonesia, and no other region in Indonesia is subjected to the multiple military operations as is West Papua. West Papua has experienced a vast security buildup. In the last decade, the military and police have approximately doubled their units and personnel. So there's a growing militarization. And there have been some reforms, they constantly say that, but not much has changed in the way the Indonesian military is handling West Papua. And their territorial structure has remained intact. But more importantly, the behavior of the officers of those armies and police is still mostly the same in relation to the total disrespect of human rights of the people of West Papua. There are various credible reports that have come out throughout the years, national and international, which describe past and current serious violation of international human rights and humanitarian law. And these are violations amounting to atrocity crimes that have never been punished or adequately addressed. And all these reports point to the most probable risk that further violation and atrocity crimes against members of the targeted group, which is us, the indigenous West Papuans, will continue. Investigation into any of these cases are rare, and it's even rarer that anyone is held accountable. Indonesia refuses to allow international observers into the region. A planned visit by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights is yet to take place. Reports are regularly submitted to the UN human rights mechanisms by very courageous Papuan CSOs, civil society organizations, and I'd like to pay my tribute to them because they work under difficult circumstances in Indonesia, in West Papua itself. But Indonesia shows little interest in cooperating with any of these mechanisms. So what does it mean for the West Papuans that Indonesia is invited as an observer in these war games that the Americans and Australians are currently having, where they are training for military operations, testing their combat readiness? And also, this is the show of strength, from what I understand, where the Chinese Navy sends boats to monitor what is going on. Now, as you remember, I started my intervention this morning by saying that in the 60s, West Papua had become of crucial strategic importance during the Cold War. And that was why the US, through its CIA, played a major role in how West Papua was illegally annexed by Indonesia. As we see another Cold War on the horizon, and we see Indonesia obviously taking sides with this imperialistic master of theirs, the people of West Papua still want to free themselves. They want their right to self-determination to be respected. So I'll take this opportunity to end by calling for the withdrawal of Indonesian troops from West Papua and the stop of the military support of the Western powers to their lackey, which is guarding their economic interests in West Papua. In relation to the West Papuan issues, we call for a negotiated solution mediated by a neutral international third party. Let's talk about this, as my sister Ronda said. Let's not do it the Western way, the European way where I live. We call for an end to all military exercises in the Pacific. The lessons from the past need to be learned. We cannot afford to have another Cold War. And if we do have one, it'll not be the same as before. We know what happened before, and we won't let it happen again. Papua Merdeka. Thank you.
Wow, what a speech. Thank you so much, Leonie, for staying up till 3 o'clock in the morning to share all that with us. So important, particularly for us in Australia who are very, amongst the peace movement, we are very, very concerned and stand in solidarity with your struggle in West Papua, knowing full well the tragedy and the horror of what's going on there. So let's stay in touch. That's fantastic. Thank you. Okay, our next speaker is from Valerie Morse. Valerie is a Wellington-based writer, activist, and gardener, and she's the author of 2 books on the war, about the war on terrorism, and a member of Peace Action Wellington. And I'm just going to pass straight over to Valerie to expand on what she might like to say from a New Zealand perspective. Thanks, Valerie.
Yeah, tēnā koutou katoa, kua huhui mai nei I tēnei ahi ma pango ma whiro ka oti te mahi. Kia ora everyone. I want to say a big thank you to the Independent and Peaceful Australia Network and the World Beyond War for hosting this webinar, and to all of the speakers, particularly the last speaker, Leonie there, Papua Merdeka. We certainly stand in solidarity around the West Papua issue, but also all of the Indigenous people around the Pacific who have long fought the forces of militarism and imperialism for hundreds of years, actually. Standing against Talisman Sabre is actually nothing new, really. It's a history of a long struggle. I feel like a little bit of an imposter here. New Zealand's participation in Talisman Sabre this year is very small, but I just want to run through a few points around New Zealand's participation. So at the moment, we've got a Labour-led government which has put a great deal of emphasis on the COVID response, and that response has a significant military component. So as a result of that, a lot of the military that would have been involved in this year's exercise are actually deployed here at home in places like the managed isolation facilities. It is also certainly our view that New Zealand is not keen at all to draw attention to its participation in this particular war game. And there's two reasons for that. One is that they don't want to draw any attention domestically because it is essentially a nominally left-wing government. So they don't want to put any emphasis on participation in these war games from the perspective of their domestic support, but they also don't want to anger the Chinese government. And New Zealand has been trying to walk a very, very fine line, increasingly fine line between its military and intelligence relationships with the United States and Australia and its largest trading partner, which is China. It's interesting that the New Zealand Brigadier General who commands the troops said, I think a lot of reassurance to our allies that they can call on New Zealand troops to be a real value add in any kind of coalition environment. So that's what New Zealand is saying behind the scenes, and that's what they're saying to Australia, to the United States, is that they can absolutely count on New Zealand to be there. And I think it's worthwhile reflecting that we have just come to the end of 20 years of war in Afghanistan, a war that the United States led, but has been side by side with Australia and New Zealand. New Zealand has been in Afghanistan for 20 years. And has committed some really astonishing war crimes along the way. So clearly no lessons have been learned. What we know this year is that in 2019, New Zealand's contribution was about 600 troops, along with light armored vehicles, helicopters, and a naval vessel. As far as I'm aware, none of that material has been deployed this year. It is a very small contingent that is going over, primarily Army and Air Force soldiers that are going over to participate. But again, I don't think that's because New Zealand doesn't want to send troops. It's more because as a result of COVID, it doesn't have much space to send troops. So New Zealand's involvement is particularly around interoperability, so maintaining that capability. And the New Zealand government has been very clear that even though we've got substantial budget pressures, it is going to continue with buying all of these weapons because they are about New Zealand's contribution to interoperability. So they're not really stuff that New Zealand actually would ideally be buying for domestic defense or security purposes. It is primarily stuff to join up with the Australians and with the United States. I would also say that New Zealand is really the beneficiary of very hardline Australian defense policies, and that's something that is not really spoken about a lot in New Zealand. But the refugee policy in New Zealand has been very much about relying on Australia as the kind of front line. So at the moment, there's a campaign here in New Zealand, in Aotearoa, to reunite a family that had tried to come to New Zealand, but was stopped by the Australian military, the Australian Navy, and have now been sent back to Malaysia. So they're a Sri Lankan family who sought asylum in New Zealand, but actually never got anywhere near here. And that's the reality, is that New Zealand is benefiting Meanwhile, New Zealand gets to sort of enjoy this global reputation as this really peaceful country, as this really progressive country, but actually we're riding off the back of incredibly racist and incredibly dangerous policies in the Pacific. So the other thing, of course, that New Zealand is benefiting from at the moment is this massive military spend up in Australia. So what I have discovered is that New Zealand defense contractors, companies in New Zealand are actually considered to be domestic suppliers in Australia. So they are vying for massive new contracts in Australia. There's a huge spend up of some, I think, 60 or 90 billion dollars for everything from warships to submarines to aircraft carriers. New Zealand is in there for all of that. And that's part of that playing off that Anzac relationship and trying to continue having those relationships without appearing to be this kind of, I suppose, aggressively postured war country. So we consider obviously Australia's external affairs and policies in the Pacific to be really dangerous, but it is really misleading to think that New Zealand's policies are substantially different from those policies. As I said, we have really been benefiting from those policies. So we are looking to ramp up things and to ramp up, I think, public knowledge here in New Zealand about the kind of training that's going on, because every other year we have an exercise Southern Katapo here, which includes Australian Defence Force, that includes nations, a number of South Pacific nations, includes US Marine Corps that come here to do military training as well. So we are honored and really appreciate this opportunity to contribute to this corridor, because it is part of something that is going on here domestically and is part of a wider struggle for decolonization, demilitarism, and for an independent and nuclear-free South Pacific. So kia ora to all the speakers and to everyone there. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk today.
Thank you so much, Valerie. I'm so pleased you could make it. And it's so important that we hear from our New Zealand brothers and sisters and for the truth to be revealed. Okay, our next speaker is coming from a place that is suffering greatly right now as a result of military exercises. Monica is here from Guåhan, and she's a representative of the Putehi Litakan Sabre Tidian. I'm sorry about the pronunciation, Monica, but you can maybe repeat that for everyone else to hear. So welcome, Monica.
Hafidei, Sainama Asi, and thank you, Annette, and to all the organizers, and of course, all the amazing previous speakers, Senator Ronda Kelly, Senator Leonie Tangama, Senator John, and Dr. Kajihiro, and of course, Valerie, who just spoke a minute ago. Thank you all so much. I'm extremely humbled to join this panel and to stand in solidarity with all of you to cancel Talisman Sabre and war games in the Pacific, and for peace and genuine security in all of our homelands. My name is Monica Flores, and I'm speaking to you from Guåhan, or Guam, in the Marianas Islands, or Lagos Zangani, which is the homeland of the Chamorro people. I'm a core member of Putehi Litakan Sabre Tidian, so that's Putehi Litakan Sabre Tidian, a direct action group and community organization dedicated to the protection of natural resources and culturally significant resources and sacred sites in Guåhan, specifically those located in sites identified for US military live fire training. We oppose the establishment of any military firing range and stand in solidarity with groups in the Northern Marianas and the larger Pacific region for the prevention of further environmental degradation and destruction on sacred lands. And we support the return of ancestral lands to Native peoples. So right now, Guam is the stomping grounds for several ongoing US military exercises at the moment, which will continue up until the coming month, including several associated with Talisman Sabre. Right now we have Pacific Iron 2021 here, and that means that we've had several stealth fighters, B-52 bombers, Strikers, Strike Eagles, Raptors, missile defense units, several kinds of land vehicles and weapons roaming all over the island and flying over us, bringing a lot of noise and disruption to our homes. And you can feel they're just so loud, you just feel it in your body, in the core of you. And so a group of B-52 bombers just arrived earlier this month, and those bombers are specifically going to take part in the Talisman Sabre exercise. And the Air Force has not disclosed how many have come, how many bombers have come, but there are many, there are quite a few right now. And with Pacific Iron, that means that 4,000 US personnel, I'm sorry, for Pacific Forager, that's a third exercise, Pacific Forager 31, that means that 4,000 US personnel are here. And this is part of the multi-domain operations throughout Oceania, as the Air Force describes it. And so all of these exercises are currently taking place with what many people on Guam call Liberation Day, which is the day that US troops arrived during World War II. It's basically the violent recapture and reoccupation of Guam from Japanese troops during the war. And with all of that rhetoric, it just pushes this pro-war, pro-US military narrative that weighs heavily on our consciousness. We just had a massive drone and fireworks show the other day on that day. And so, of course, Liberation Day events and the Liberation Day messages, which I actually refer to and many of my friends refer to as Reoccupation Day, has also been tied to this campaign to push vaccines in Guåhan, to liberate Guåhan from COVID-19 as well. So it's extremely layered and extremely problematic. And of course, many of you are already familiar with some of the problems we face regarding US military activities and the spread of COVID-19 here in Guåhan last March. Many of you already know that the US Navy burdened our community with thousands of sailors from the USS Theodore Roosevelt who stayed in hotels. Over 1,150 sailors had tested positive. And then an Air Force unit with several confirmed positive cases also violated movement restrictions and visited over 30 local businesses, which eventually led to our second wave of COVID. We had our highest rates throughout that summer, June, July, and in August, including our governor and lieutenant governor both testing positive for the COVID-19 virus. And our highest rates of death in August and September. It used to be that the military rates were being reported, but they are no longer made available to the public. And we would see that a lot of the largest spikes, when they were public, were directly related to the military personnel here in Guåhan. And also last year, we were made aware of this horrible scarring of our land, the clearing of an ancient village known as Sabana and Fadeng and Mogwek. And this is for the new Marine base. Now, if we could just share just really quick some of these pictures. This is the clearing for the cantonment over Mogwek village. And it's a permanent scarring of our land. We also have another image I'd like to share is the clearing for the firing ranges, which are right over Latekzin and over several sacred ancestral lands down here. So 4 of the 5 ranges have already been cleared for that. And so this massive clearing means, if we could paint a picture, a visual for you, 925 football fields or soccer fields of land cleared in these for this cantonment. And so we had a ceremony in April for this land. There were 12 unique burials that were also desecrated as a result of this clearing of our ancestors. And so these are just some of the things that, we are dealing with here in Guåhan. Just to share with you some of the figures associated with the military activities construction slash destruction, also associated with the transfer of Marines from Okinawa to Guåhan, include over 1,219 acres of limestone forest for the new Marine base and the ranges, close to 7 million ammunitions a year fired over our main water source, our Northern Lands aquifer. So our main water source is at a very high risk for contamination and permanent destruction, as well as the withdrawal of over 1 million gallons of water per day. So that's 365 million gallons of water a year taken by the Air Force for the base. And so we also have a risk for salination. in our waterlands. Several endangered and threatened species, including traditional medicines, will be permanently impacted. In fact, over 2,000 native fadang or cycad trees, which used to be the most plentiful tree on Guam, were destroyed with the clearing that I shared earlier. And 269 historic properties, evidence of the sacred evidence of the lives of our ancestors, will be destroyed. Not to mention that Guam already has 19 Superfund sites and over 80 contaminated sites that the US military has yet to address. And so with all of that information, the update, this report from Guåhan, I'd like to share now the Patela Texan solidarity statement for the Pacific Peace Network today. And so we, the Guam-based group Patela Texan Sabre Tidian, align our efforts with regional movements working to prevent environmental degradation and destruction of sacred and native lands and waters. Patela Texan Sabre Tidian vehemently opposes Talisman Sabre and its violent activities and war games that lead to the destruction and desecration of culturally significant sites on land and sea, including the Great Barrier Reef. Talisman Sabre is a clear injustice of US imperialism, environmental racism, and a violation of the inherent rights of Indigenous Pacific peoples and all that is sacred. We oppose the occupation of over 17,000 soldiers, including 8,000 US military personnel and nearly 800 from other countries in Australia to carry out these horrendous war maneuvers. We stand in opposition of the burdens placed on Pacific communities, especially those in Australia, which include increased crime and risks associated with COVID-19. Patela Texan Sabre Tidian stands in solidarity for the return of ancestral lands to Native communities. The return of land back to Native peoples must include demilitarization and the end to the violent colonial actions that impact our movements towards true sovereignty. We stand in solidarity with all Pacific peoples fighting to protect and defend our sacred waters and land, our sacred Tasi, our ocean. We stand in solidarity, we share in the responsibility and commitment to end oppression in all its forms and an unwavering commitment to our liberation. The people of the Pacific should no longer be deprived of living in peace in our homelands. And so with that, I just want to thank you all again and leave with an image from our ceremony last April, which included a lot of beautiful singing and storytelling from some of the family members, the original clans of Letexan who were forcefully removed from their homelands by the US military, and with several of our elders, Sina Auntie Hope Cristobal, who a lot of you know, was also there leading the way for us. And so thank you all so much for the time and for allowing us to share our experiences here in Guåhan, and Sizos Masis and Sina Maasi.
Thank you very much, Monica. That was really much appreciated. And your message of support, could you please put that in the chat box so that we can all make sure that we keep that and share that locally? That's fantastic. Our next speaker is Maria Loranaria, I believe is how to pronounce it. Maria is from the Philippines. She became active at the height of the war in Vietnam. At that time, US bases in the Philippines, especially the two largest naval and air force bases outside the US mainland, were the hub of operations in the war of aggression in Vietnam. And I think most of us know just how horrible that war was. She is presently connected with Kilusan, I think is how you pronounce it, and the Philippines Network, Women's Network for Peace and Security. So welcome to the webinar, Maria.
Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this webinar. I'm going to discuss to you about the increasing military exercises of the United States in our country, and other related matters to the U.S. What's this agenda in the Philippines. Now that our president seems to be very pro-China, or appears to be pro-China. Okay. In October 2016, President Duterte threatened to cancel all US military exercises and that he wanted US troops to leave the country. We were not surprised. After all, he did not allow US troops to hold drills in Davao City when he was mayor there. In December 2016, our Secretary of National Defense announced that they canceled a few exercises, including Carrot Philippines, a big naval exercise, and Fiblex, an amphibious landing exercise. He explained that the president didn't want patrols in the South China Sea and maritime exercises that focus on assault and amphibious landings. Many political commentators said that Duterte was just projecting a non-confrontational stance to China. And people like us who had been opposing US wars were a little upbeat. But no, in January 2017, our Department of National Defense announced that the president was honoring the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, or EDCA, that allows US to use Philippine military locations. Agreed upon earlier were Philippine can you see it? Were Philippine military agreed upon earlier were Fort Magsaysay in Nueva Ecija, Basa Air Base in Florida, Pampanga, Benito Ebuen Air Base in Cebu, Antonio Bautista Air Base in Palawan, and Lumbia Air Base in Cagayan de Oro. What happened to the exercises? In May 2017, General Eduardo Año, the then AFP Chief of Staff, after attending a Mutual Defense Board meeting in Honolulu, told the media they agreed to conduct 261 joint military activities in 2018 from 258 in 2017, so an additional 3. In September 30, 2018, US and Philippine military officials agreed to increase the number of exercises for 2019 to 281. So that's additional 20. Balikatan 2019. You have heard of Balikatan. It's the biggest exercise in the Philippines. Balikatan 2019 pushed through with 4,000 Filipinos participating, 3,500 US and 50 Australian soldiers. Contrary to Duterte's instructions in 2016, they held live fire trainings, urban operations, and other combat drills in Palawan, facing South China Sea. Except for the bigger part of 2020, when most of the planned exercises did not push through because of COVID-19, the trend is an increasing number of military exercises held jointly with the US. And not only this, the US has been using locations other than the 5 I already mentioned. The US military has not stopped using Subic for exercises and more. It continually uses a part of Clark, not only for exercises, but also as monitoring station of some units. It is continually using Crow Valley bombing range, now called Colonel Ernesto Rabina Air Force Base in Tarlac. It is continuously using facilities in the Romulo Espaldo Naval Facility, Naval Station within the camp of the AFP Westcom. President Duterte himself claimed in one of his weekly reports to the people that the US has many outposts and stationed arms in the Philippines, and that it is making Subic its military base again. Yes, the Philippines is very important for the United States strategy in the Indo-Pacific, in what it calls Indo-Pacific, a strategy for war now against China. As many military analysts have said, if the US wants to take on China, it should take the Philippines. That's why it approved in June 2021 the potential sale of F-16 fighter jets and Sidewinder and Harpoon missiles to the Philippines at a combined value of more than $2.5 billion. That's why the Joint U.S. Military Assistance Group Philippines delivered $3 million worth of weapons and equipment, including 10 machine guns and 9 mortar tubes, to the AFP on June 21, 2021, and another batch of the same kind worth 1 million on July 4. And that's why also the DOD Secretary Austin is coming tonight. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your information about the Philippines, Maria. Particularly interested in the Australian involvement in that exercise. So next on our speaking list, we have Sung-Hee Choi. And Sung-Hee joins the struggle against the militarization of Jeju. She's a long-time activist. She works with the Ganjong Peace Network and the Ganjong villages against the naval base there. And she was also one of our speakers at an IPAN conference in Melbourne in 2015, I think it was. So welcome, Sung-Hee. Are you there, Sung-Hee?
Hello. Can I share my PPT?
Yes, you can.
Okay. I don't know how. Okay. Well, I don't know why it does not show up.
We can see the PowerPoint, Sung-Hee. Are you there, Sung-Hee? Yeah.
While I'm trying to open my PPT, let me share with you some points. Okay. First of all, thanks so much for inviting me. Okay, I think I did not sleep enough last night. Sorry, everyone. Okay, thanks so much for inviting me. I'm really appreciating this wonderful webinar, and I so thank you, Annette, to organizing this really important webinar conference. Do you hear me? Okay. While I'm trying to show you my PPT, I want to emphasize 5 points regarding this exercise. First of all, about Quad. As you know, in my understanding, this exercise led by United States and Australia is joined by other countries. The participation countries are Japan, South Korea, and UK, New Zealand, and Canada. And then there are 4 observer countries. They are France, Germany, India, and Indonesia. I'm reminding this because I think it's very interesting. Okay, we tend to think that this exercise is about the Indo-Pacific war exercises. However, I noticed that there are countries who are not belong to Indo-Pacific. They are UK, Germany, and France. And then like the UK, it's for the first time for South Korea to join this war exercise. So I noticed to this point, where are we going? Where are we going? I remind that the Paul Leckamera, who became recently the United States Forces of Korea commander, he said that he wants the USFK go beyond Korean Peninsula. And I also hear that, I remember that Mark Esper, the former war secretary in the United States, he said that he wants to have about 500 warships in the Pacific by 2045. So what I'm noticing is that this region of Indo-Pacific is becoming the hotspot for the United States imperialism and militarism. That is why it is so important, our role, to share information and then to talk to each other, because we are the people who should watch what's happening in this region, and you are responsible to share the information. Okay, I come from the Jeju Island. And then it is the base which is located in the southern tip of the Korean Peninsula. And it is the base where most advanced warships of South Korea are deployed. So the 4,400-ton destroyer Guåhan, which was sent to Talisman Sabre, is from the Jeju Navy base. So that's why we should notice the Jeju Navy base. That is the base where ships are going to the whole Gulf of Aden, including Hormuz Strait. And that is the base where ships would go to Southeast China Sea. That is the base where ships start to join the RIMPAC and also Talisman Sabre. And I want to share what I noticed during my 10 years of struggle against the Jeju Navy base. First of all, I already shared that the war exercise is going beyond Indo-Pacific. And now the ship, aircraft carrier Queen Elizabeth, is coming to East Asia, and the 2 of UK ships would be deployed in the Pacific region. So that is not only the United States. We are witnessing that United States, UK, France, and Germany are coming to this region. Why? I already shared that this region is becoming important spot. Secondly, I really appreciate that Kyle told that all the war is racialized. I want to emphasize the point because, as you notice, the recent hatred against Asians is, in my understanding, is to prepare war against Asian countries. It is like the anti-Muslim propaganda was being prepared before the war against Iraq and Afghanistan as well. So I just remind that why we should warn against such racialism, importantly, the Asian hatred, how it is for the preparation of war. So I request all my friends to watch the move, and that might be the preparation of war against North Korea and China, I think. So that's why you should watch. Third, what I notice is that the media report about the trace of warships is becoming decreasing. So for example, when the Australian warship Bellora came to dismay, I could not find any Korean article about that. Do you mean, you understand what I mean? It was very strange for me. And I searched for English article. I could not find any English article that Australia warship is coming to the Jeju Navy base. So it is only after that we people in the Jeju made a protest statement against it. My point is that is why it becomes very important for us to share information. And then why it is very important for us to observe what's happening in the military bases in our region. If not, we would not know what's going on in our bases. Regarding Australia warships, let me share some things. Okay, so now the ships are going from the Jeju Navy base to all over the world. And the Australian ships are also coming to Jeju Navy base 3 times. First, in 2017, the HMS Melbourne and Parramatta. And second, during the International Fleet Review in 2018. And thirdly, in May this year. So that is why I pay attention to the role of Australia. What's happening in Australia? Okay, we know that Australia is one part of the 4 Quad countries: United States, Japan, Australia, and India. And then South Korea is forced to join the Quad by the United States. South Korean government, oh no, we don't want to join. However, the point is that there is an alliance that United States wants to really push. It is a trilateral alliance among South Korea, United States, and Japan. So even though South Korea does not join Quad, it would work as a part of the United States Quad strategy, thanks to that trilateral military alliance.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So maybe so many minutes. Okay.
That's right. Yeah. Unfortunately, we're going to have to move on just in terms of timing. But gee, it's great to hear your perspective again, and we value our relationship greatly with you and the people of South Korea and Jeju. Thank you so much, Sung-hee.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Now we've only got 2 speakers left, and each of these speakers has, deserved a whole session on their own, really. And there's so much to learn from each of the people who are presenting. But we have only got 2 people left, and then hopefully there'll be a bit of time for questions and discussion. So our next speaker is Mizuki Nakamura. Mizuki is a member of One Love Take, a Tokyo-based group working with residents of Take in protest against militarization and destruction of the Yambaru forest in northern Okinawa. For this webinar, she's going to share how her hometown in Tokyo's suburbs is being turned into a joint military exercise field for the United States and Japan. So welcome.
Thank you, Annette, for the introduction. And hello, everyone. And thank you very much for having me in this wonderful and meaningful webinar. I'm learning so much for each one of you. So thank you so much. So I would like to share my slide. Let's see. Oops. Hold on. I'm sorry. Okay. So today I would like to talk about how my hometown, which is just outside of Tokyo, is now turned into a joint exercise field for the U.S. forces and the Japanese military, as our government, the Japanese government, is trying to more and more incorporate our military into the U.S. military. So this is the map of the Ground Self-Defense Force Camp Narashino, just in suburb of Tokyo, just outside of Tokyo. And as you can see, there's an open space in the middle of the map. That's the camp. And as you can see, it sits in the middle of the densely populated area. And about 1 million people are living around this camp. And this camp is, by the way, is very small, only like 2 square kilometers. And more than 50 schools are around this camp, including daycare centers and kindergartens and elementary school, junior high school, and high schools, including the ones that I graduated from. And in this particular camp, the self-defense forces, they are holding this type of exercise, the parachute drop training. And since it's a very small camp surrounded by the densely populated area, paratroopers often land accidentally on the area outside of the camp. In the past, they landed on a residential home, on a crowded road, or on a school ground. So that could lead to a very serious accident. And the residents around the camp are also suffering from noise pollution and the dust spread in their area. So right now, as they are incorporating with the United States more and more, the US forces started to join the exercise in Camp Narashino in 2017. And now they are holding their joint exercises every year since then. And their latest joint exercise took place in May, when Tokyo and the surrounding areas were still under the state of emergency and intensive preventive measures due to the COVID-19. And these are the photos that I got from the Twitter account of the 1st Airborne Brigade. And as you can see, these huge military aircraft, they are CH-130 from US Yokota Air Base in Tokyo. So they would carry those Japanese paratroopers, and then they would jump off from that airplanes for their parachute drop training. And according to the news here, those Japanese paratroopers are now in Guam, and then they will start joining their exercises today in Andersen Air Force Base. So we are very sorry for sending our troops to the sacred land of our brothers and sisters in Guåhan. And another issue that we have is that the Japanese government has purchased military aircraft Osprey, which is a very dangerous aircraft, from the US, and is now plans to deploy them in Camp Narashino in the densely populated area by the end of this year for their flight exercises over our hometown. And of course, we have learned from our friends, the residents of Takae, Okinawa, about how dangerous this type of aircraft is. And as the US military Osprey fly over their area in Takae, they are constantly suffering from tremendous noise pollution and risks of accident. And in these pictures, you can see how low they are flying over the homes of the residents and also the forest, the Yambaru forest. So some of the Takai residents actually had to move out to stay away from those harmful military operations. So now the local residents near the Camp Narashino are actively protesting against military exercises and the Osprey deployment by organizing a lot of things like rallies and demonstrations and petition campaigns and so on. And we believe that the Japanese Self-Defense Forces Osprey will soon be joined by the US military Osprey, and will together use the sky above us for their regular flight exercises if we keep silent. So we continue to be active and raise voice against the militarization in our area. So in closing, as my solidarity message, I must say that in the past, my country, Japan, colonized and tortured many of your people and your land in the Asia Pacific. And because of that, I believe that we are also responsible for the serious issues that you are facing right now. And for this, I would like to apologize on behalf of the like-minded people in Japan. And I will promise to keep raising voice together and keep fighting together. And I'm also sending the message of solidarity with from our dear friends in Takai, Okinawa. So thank you for your kind attention. Thank you.
Annette, you're muted.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Mizuki. Your heartfelt messages have been well received, and yeah, we stand with you in solidarity with your efforts to move out of this awful militarizing era that we're all living through. So our last but not least speaker for today is Anne. Anne Wright served 29 years in the US Army and retired as a colonel. She has also been a US diplomat for 16 years and served in US embassies in all sorts of places, Nicaragua, Grenada, Somalia, Afghanistan, to name a few. She resigned from the US government very publicly in March 2003 in opposition to the US war on Iraq, for which we applaud her. And for the last 18 years, she's been a relentless advocate for peace. Welcome, Anne. We welcome you to the webinar.
Well, thank you very much, Annette, and thank you for organizing this, and what wonderful speakers we've had from all over the region. And if Mizuki says her apologies from Japan for having the Japanese military, well, double, triple, quadruple apologies for the United States and all of the military exercises it's having on all of your lands. I'm speaking here from the same place that Kyle was, from the occupied sovereign nation of Hawaii. That is the site of just militarism on steroids. And I'll show you just a little bit of it. I want to see if I have any better luck than, let's see, multiple than Song Hee to try to get my, oh Lord, I tell you. Let's see, how many participants? No, we can all do it. Everybody can, I can. There, oh, wait a minute, we got it, I think. Yes, let's look right here and hope that that is going to come up.
Yes,
do
it
we?
is.
Okay, do we have, is the first one an Australian citizen protesting?
It is indeed.
All right, well, good. Well, thanks to Robin for providing this. I wanted to first start off to say, you know, this is a huge military exercise, the second largest one the United States has in Asia and the Pacific. The biggest one still is RIMPAC, Rim of the Pacific. But here in Hawaii, I'll just quickly tell you what we're up against. Today in the newspaper, we have two major articles about things that are going on here in Hawaii. The one on the left talks about missile tests that are going to be going on the island of Kauai. It's actually Patriot missiles, which are for the first time, the United States fired Patriot missiles in Talisman Sabre in Australia. And we now have the US missile group from Okinawa that's coming to Kauai to test some more missiles. And then to go back up here, the second article was about a Homeland Defense radar. Well, it's not even a radar that works, but the US or the Hawaiian Congressional Committee wants, or congressional delegation wants $2 billion spent here in Hawaii on a radar that doesn't even work. So we as activists here in Hawaii have lots and lots of challenges for us. But what I want to talk about is out in the region of the Western Pacific, and particularly the East and South China Sea. You all live out there, you know exactly what the disputes are on the various islands that many of the nations dispute whose territory it is. And there are all sorts of lines that are drawn. There are all sorts of things that are delineating who says they have what. Well, it's causing a lot of trouble, as you well know. One of the things is that the Chinese have decided that they will build on various 9 atolls. They're going to build up military bases there, and that has triggered a big response. The Chinese Navy only has 2 aircraft carriers. It doesn't have as huge a Navy as the United States, but of course, the United States says they have an aircraft carrier, and now they have 2, and you know, they're coming after us. Well, as a response to this, all sorts of huge military operations are going on in the oceans, in the South China Sea, in the Philippine Sea. And here is a photograph of an Australian ship that's with a US ship that's doing South China Sea operations. They put it under freedom of navigation ideas, you know, but they're out there just to say to the Chinese, stay out of what's called, the South China Sea. It does even say that. The Pentagon is saying, well, we're going to establish a permanent naval force in the Pacific Ocean, similar to an established naval force that the US has had in the Atlantic, but it'll be the first time that this has been created. Now, what else is going on? Okay, we've got China, but we also have Russia. Interestingly enough, earlier this month, all of a sudden we had the largest naval exercises the Russians have done, and they came 400 miles off the west coast of Hawaii. It was very, very interesting. We in Hawaii didn't know anything about it until all of a sudden some of the jets from the Air Force Base here started taking off, and then there were inquiries, what's happening? Well, there were Russian airplanes that were there, and it turned out there was a large Russian fleet that had come 400 miles. It was kind of like, well, you know, we're doing the same thing to Russia. We do the same thing to China. Well, it was a big deal when somebody did it to the United States, and we had all of these surface ships, we had anti-submarine aircraft, we had long-range bombers. And I mention this because it's, you know, it is a huge threat for us all as citizens that say we don't want to die by, you know, wars again. I mean, these are why should we be talking wars? Why should we have it put up with these huge military operations, these war maneuvers, these preparations for war? And here's another photograph of aircraft, US and Russian aircraft side by side. This is going on all over the Pacific. We look at what else is going on. In Hawaii, where we had the Russians off the west coast of Hawaii, we had a huge US military aircraft carrier group that has about 20 ships in that. And that group is now heading on to the South China Sea. One of the places that you can find a lot of information about what military operations are going on, what naval maneuvers are going on, it's on Twitter. It is unbelievable how much information that particularly the United States is sharing. And I would suspect it's because they want the Chinese to know what we are doing. But we as citizens can find out very easily how many ships are out there. Here's in the South China Sea, artillery practice in the South China Sea by another one of the US aircraft carrier groups, the Ronald Reagan. Here's another one, flight operations in the Indo-Pacific, they say, but flight operations that take place all the time off these aircraft carriers. Here we have other ships that were doing amphibious operations in the in the Philippine Sea. More flight operations coming off the aircraft carriers. And here we have in Okinawa, where the US Marine Corps was having amphibious operations again. If you really want to find out how many military operations that the US is sponsoring with your countries and with other countries, it's on the websites, and it is horrific. The numbers, this is page 1. And Balacan, which our dear friend from the Philippines mentioned as one of the large exercises that the US have, is sitting right there on it. Here's page number 2. Here's page number 3. It is a huge amount of military exercises that are going on in our region, in the Asia Pacific region. And I admire so much when we saw the citizen outreach, the citizen protests that they showed in around the camp, Narashino, and also Takai, and had Sung Hee been able to get her PowerPoint going. I mean, the activists in Jeju Island and South Korea in general are really strong, trying to hold their government accountable. So again, our apologies from the United States for what all the United States is doing in the region. It's certainly making it a much more dangerous place. And with that sad news, thank you again for organizing this excellent presentation of things from all over our region. Thank you, Annette.
Well, thank you, Anne, as well. As in the preparation for this webinar, I just wanted to also alert people to what we did put together, those of us in the Pacific Peace Network organizing group, a declaration from the Pacific calling for peace in the Pacific. Now, I just wanted to let you know that 150 people have signed that declaration, and it is ongoing. So please share to all who identify as a people of the Pacific. I'll put the link up for endorsements in the chat line, but I'd like to now open it up for any questions or contributions that people would like to make. Greta, have we got any questions in the chat box?
Yes, Liz has collected them. Liz, go ahead.
Yeah, kia ora, everybody. Thank you again. One of the questions that's come through in the boxes is looking at the corporations, and I think Margie Pistorius asked which corporation makes the Osprey, which I think is Raytheon. And so let's ask the question about how going after the corporations is a strong way forward as opposed to going after the governments. Is there some responses about that?
So would anyone of our speakers like to make comment on the question that's been raised about identifying who the corporations are that profit from everything, whether it's war preparations or actually going to war?
I'd be more than happy to take a stab at that. Annette?
That'd be great, Jordan, thanks.
All right. Look, wonderful question. I'm always greatly disturbed whenever I arrive in Canberra, into Canberra Airport, which is the airport for the National Parliament here in Australia. The defence industry, the weapons making industry, buys out permanently every billboard in the airport. So from the minute you hit the ground, through the terminal all the way through collecting your baggage, you are looked down on by a bunch of advertising billboards for Raytheon and for Boeing and for all the other very large weapons manufacturers. They also make significant donations to our Australian War Memorial. They give hundreds of thousands of dollars and personally sponsor exhibits. In fact, you can, if you go on their website, you can actually click through a link on the Australian War Memorial website, and it will take you to the BAE Systems website. There's a really horrendous level of kind of insidious ownership there. In fact, a revolving plate of corporate sponsorships, including arms manufacturers, is one of the first things you see when you go through the front door to the Australian War Memorial. So it's quite insidious. In terms of the value of challenging these weapons manufacturers, I think it's absolutely critical. Absolutely critical. Part of the Greens policy that I was talking about earlier is an explicit end to Australia's participation in the global arms trade, and a immediate halt to our government stated ambition to become one of the world's top 10 arms manufacturers, which is an absolutely unacceptable and also technically unattainable goal that the Liberals have set us on with the support of the Labor Party here in Australia. I think somebody spoke earlier. I'm so sorry, I forget the name of the presenter, but they were talking about the interplay between defence manufacturing and the broader industrial base. And I think we really do see that here in Western Australia, where I'm based, where often the answer to the question of what does the future of our complex manufacturing industry look like is always kind of answered with, well, it's the defence industry. And there's a great argument in Australia over whether the submarine program, which is in terrible disarray at the moment, should be constructed here or maintained here in WA or in South Australia, as the two manufacturing bases argue over those different locations. So I think it's absolutely critical to call them out and to call out their influence, because it is toxic and ever prevalent, and often, unfortunately, there's a great level of linkage between the defense departments, the military, the top level of military policy making and of command, and of the so-called think tanks that actually shape a lot of the standard policy thinking in Canberra, so that you have a really complex constellation of corporate defense influence around the entire conversation, which is one of the things that I think we really need to challenge.
Thanks so
Thank
much,
you.
Jordan.
Yeah. Thank you, Jordan. And I also want to point out the work that has been done by people in Australia earlier, a few months ago, the Disrupt Land Forces effort, which was, I think, was very powerful and very successful. And I know there's some people on the call here, Margie and Robin, who have been, and others probably who have been involved with that. That's another really important thing. Another question that's come up in the chat here is, who is pressurizing their governments to include militarism in climate commitments at COP26? Is that something that anyone's involved with?
Yeah. Yes. In the U.S., there are a lot of organizations that have signed letters and appeals to our U.S. delegation, and I think it's gone into a general UN letter campaign also, pleading with nations to say we have to have the environmental degradation that's caused by the military, the pollution and all of that, as a part of this whole issue of climate change and the environment. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Anyone else want to comment about that?
Yeah, me. Songin? Yes.
Yes.
Can I comment? Yes. Okay. My answer will be very specific. One of the ways that we can reduce the militarism in the Pacific is to end the Korean War. That is one of the specific things that we can do. How? Very simple. sign to the petition that I put the link in the right in the chatting box. Why? Because the United States say, okay, the North Korea is our enemy, the China is our enemy, we should build up arms. But if there is no war, there is no end of the official, there is official end of a Korean War, it's much easier for us to reduce arms race. And then I'm so sorry, just one addition. I want to show this. Can you see the background? That this is the from people Gangjong in the Jeju. We are sending you the solidarity message, the Stop the Talisman Sabre War exercise. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think we've just got time for one last, because it's nearly 3 minutes up to the hour here. And so, but it's this question about independence, Hawaiian independence, Guam independence, being these countries being liberated from the US. So David Swanson's asking yeah, would it be helpful to push for independence in these countries?
I would say yes. I think that's, the decolonization and self-determination is an unfinished project in the North Pacific. And that's partly why we have so much militarization in this region, why we can't pass a nuclear-free treaty for this region. And so I think that would be a start. And this month is, on July 31st is La Ho'iho'i Hawaiian Sovereignty Restoration Day. It was a holiday of the Hawaiian Kingdom, and it's made a revival. And this year there's many events done virtually on different islands, some music, cultural, political events. So if you look up, I'll put the link in the chat. There's many great educational and cultural activities going on, and a whole new generation that's getting activated around this. So I'll put that in there and share it. Thank you. Great question.
Should probably add Australian independence from the United States.
I think so.
Thank you, Kyle.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think we have reached our time limit. And we've gone to 2 hours, but we've had some amazing presentations from you all. And I'm sure it's left us with a sense of, well, solidarity between the peoples of the Pacific, and an inspiration to build on these relationships and to build that peace movement that we absolutely need if we are going to prevent what looms as World War III. It's horrible to even say those words, but unless we mobilize people from all nations to declare their intention to not cooperate with any of the governments who would support war, we are at risk of that happening. War is not the answer. A just peace is what is needed, based on non-violent conflict resolution, and one that must have women at the table. So I thank you all again for coming along. And in particular, a big thanks to all the speakers who've prepared for today, and a big thanks to World Beyond War, who have been incredibly supportive of our very newly developed Pacific Peace Network. We definitely want to grow this network of people across the Pacific with that aim of working towards a zone of peace. So please add your name to that endorsement of the Pacific Peace Declaration, and tick the box if you would like to hear more from us that's on that declaration. So thank you. Have a great rest of the day. Is there anything else anyone wanted to say? No? Thanks again to Jordan as well, because I believe Jordan Stilljohn was supposed to be having a bit of a break, and he's made a special effort to come along to our webinar today. Thank you.
Think of a better way to spend a Saturday. It's been wonderful to be with you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Greta.
Stop the war exercise. Stop the Talisman Sabre. Yay.
Thank you to all the other people who've helped to make this possible. Lisa Natividad, Cora Fabros, Robin Tobenfeld, Liz, and numerous others. So thanks again, everybody. Bye-bye now.
Bye.